I thought I was calling to ask a simple question. I wanted to know when the wedding was. That was it. I had pressed the phone tight to my ear, waiting for the sound of my daughter's voice, maybe even a little laugh, as if she had just been too busy to update me. I wanted to tell her I had my turquoise dress ready, a soft fabric that shimmered under the light, the one I had spent $250 on. It was still hanging in the closet, tags untouched, waiting for its moment. But instead of laughter, instead of joy, I got his voice. Marcus. Cold, sharp, and cutting. It was yesterday, not for you. I remember every syllable. I stood frozen in my living room, phone pressed against my cheek, staring at the oak sofa I had bought for them years ago. $1,400, a solid piece, meant to last a lifetime. They lounged on it like it was theirs, and maybe it was, but only because I had handed it over. Eva said nothing. My daughter, my only child, stood behind him, her head tilted down. Her silence was louder than his words. It felt like the ground disappeared. I wasn't invited. I wasn't welcome. My daughter had chosen a life where I didn't belong. I kept hearing the way he said it. Not for you, not for me, not for the woman who had carried Eva through every fever and heartbreak, who had held her hand when Robert, my husband, passed away. Not for the woman who gave her everything she could. I glanced toward my closet, where the turquoise dress waited, neat on its hanger. The same color Eva loved as a little girl, when she would beg me to let her twirl in my scarves. Now it was nothing more than wasted fabric. I remembered the envelope on my table, a card inside with $1,500 I had set aside as a wedding gift. My fingers had folded the bills one by one. I had told myself it wasn't much, but it was a gesture, a blessing. I had been ready to show up with tears in my eyes and pride in my heart. Instead, I was left outside, not even given a seat in the back row. I had paid their rent, $650 a month for 3 years. I had filled their fridge, bought them a used car, covered Marcus's medication when he said he couldn't afford it. I had done all of this quietly, believing love was shown through sacrifice. I had believed that one day Eva would look at me with gratitude, that Marcus would finally respect me. But in that single moment, with his smug words, all of it cracked. I stared at the screen of my phone even after the call ended, his voice echoing inside me. My chest tightened. I could hear my heartbeat rushing in my ears. My hands trembled as I lowered the phone. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was drowning in my own living room, surrounded by things I had bought, reminders of every dollar I had poured into their lives. Yet I was the one treated as disposable. Eva's eyes haunted me. The way she looked down, avoiding mine, letting Marcus speak for her. She used to call me her rock. She used to call every night just to tell me about her day. She used to laugh when I told her she deserved better. Now she stood behind him, letting him erase me from the most important day of her life. I sat down slowly on the sofa. My knees felt weak. I ran my hand across the wooden armrest, remembering the day it was delivered. Marcus had boasted about how perfect it was for their home, never mentioning it was my checkbook that made it possible. I leaned back, and the silence of the room pressed down on me. The turquoise dress still waited upstairs. The envelope with $1,500 still sat on the table. My hopes, my sacrifices, my place as a mother, all of it seemed like a cruel joke. I whispered to myself, "Not for me." The words stung like fresh cuts. That night, I could not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their smiles. I saw Eva in her white dress, the same dress I had unknowingly paid for, with the money I thought was helping her build a life. I saw Marcus raising a glass with his family, people who had been given my seat. The champagne flute sparkled in the pictures I found later online, but all I felt was the emptiness where I should have been. My heart broke, but beneath the pain, something else stirred. A sharp edge of clarity. I had been blind, but now my eyes were opening. Before I take you further into this story, I want you to think about something. Have you ever been excluded from the very moment you dreamed of being part of? Have you ever felt the people you loved most cut you out as if you never mattered? If you have, stay with me. What happened next is something you need to hear. And if you haven't, listening might help you understand someone else who has. I woke up the next morning with the phone still on the table beside me. My head ached from replaying that sentence all night long. I had not eaten. I had not slept. The turquoise dress still hung upstairs, untouched, like a cruel reminder of my foolish hope. My daughter's wedding had happened without me, and I had been told I was not special enough to witness it, but I still clung to a small thread of denial, telling myself maybe I misunderstood, maybe there was some mix-up. That hope shattered when I turned on my laptop. My sister Martha had called earlier, leaving a message. Her voice trembled with confusion. "Talia, when is the wedding? I was about to send flowers." I held the phone in my hand and whispered into the silence. It already happened. Then I sat at my kitchen table, hands resting on the wood scarred with years of use, and clicked on social media. The first image hit me like a punch. Eva stood in a white gown. The satin shimmered under the lights, a soft glow I recognized instantly. I had handed her $1,200 months ago, telling her, "Buy yourself something beautiful when the time comes." She had smiled sweetly, promising she would. And there it was, the gown I had unknowingly purchased, hugging her figure as she leaned against Marcus, who smirked as though he had conquered the world. I scrolled further. Their glasses raised in celebration. Marcus's family stood proudly around them, champagne fizzing over crystal. His mother's pearls caught the light. His father's suit looked tailored. Every detail screamed of elegance and inclusion. Everyone smiled. Everyone belonged. Everyone except me. I leaned closer to the screen, desperate for a glimpse of my daughter's eyes. Did she look for me in the crowd? Did she hesitate at all as she cut the cake? But no. Her smile looked wide and certain. Her hands rested firmly in Marcus's. She had made her choice. She had chosen a life that no longer required my presence. I thought about the envelope still on my counter, holding $1,500 in crisp bills. I had imagined sliding it into Eva's hand, maybe even watching her tear up with gratitude. I had dusted every corner of my home, polished the silverware, and prepared my modest kitchen to host them after the ceremony. I had rehearsed in my mind how I would tell Marcus, "Thank you for taking care of her," even though he never had. I wanted so badly to believe we could start over, that I could still be part of their future. Instead, I stared at images of strangers drinking toasts in my daughter's name. My breath came shallow. My fingers trembled against the mouse. I saw details only a mother would notice: the ribbon in Eva's hair, the pearl earrings, the way her bouquet had lilies, the flowers Robert once planted in our backyard. She had remembered him, but not me. I whispered into the quiet, "How could you?" My voice cracked. Tears slid down my face, hot and bitter. The photos kept coming, group shots, dancing, even the cake, layered and frosted in white, a centerpiece too perfect to belong to the life I thought I knew. They were celebrating a union I had helped fund with every check I had written: rent, groceries, furniture, even the car Marcus drove to work. I had built the foundation of their comfort, and yet I was erased from the story. Martha called again. This time I answered. "It's done," I told her, my voice hollow. "What do you mean, done?" "They married yesterday, without me." There was a long pause on the other end. Then Martha whispered, "Talia, I don't understand. You've given them everything." I swallowed hard. That's the point. They wanted everything, except me. Her silence spoke more than words. She tried to comfort me, but her voice cracked too. She had seen the pictures as well. She knew. I closed the laptop slowly, pressing my palm against its cool surface, as if trying to contain the pain spilling out of me. I thought of the turquoise dress again, hanging quietly upstairs, a ghost of the celebration I would never attend. The fabric shimmered in my memory, but now it felt like mockery. I rose from the chair and paced the kitchen, my footsteps heavy against the floor. The house felt too quiet, too empty. Every corner echoed with the truth I could no longer deny. I had not been forgotten. I had been deliberately left out. I was never part of their plan. That realization cut deeper than any insult Marcus had thrown. It was not an oversight. It was a decision. And Eva had let it happen. My daughter, the little girl who once clung to my hand at every school play, had turned her back on me when it mattered most. I sank into the chair again, my hands clutching the edge of the table. My chest heaved with sobs I couldn't hold back. The humiliation burned hotter than grief. It wasn't just that I had missed the wedding, it was that they had made sure I would. In that moment, staring at the closed laptop, I whispered to myself, I was never meant to be part of it. And with those words, the last fragile thread of denial finally snapped. 1 week passed, though it felt like a blur of heavy mornings and sleepless nights. I thought the silence might last, that they would stay gone, living their married life without me. But silence is never free. It always has a price. The phone rang just after breakfast, the shrill tone cutting through the stillness of the house. I didn't recognize the number, but I picked up anyway. It was Marcus. His voice came through sharp and direct, like he owned the very air I was breathing. The credit cards are maxed out. Did you transfer the $2,000? Not a hello, not a question about my health, just a demand, delivered like an order. I sat there at the kitchen table, staring at the wood grain beneath my fingertips, listening to his tone. I remembered all the other calls before this one, calls that came late at night when he said the rent was due, calls where he claimed Eva needed medicine, calls where he told me his car had broken down and they couldn't manage without me. Each time, I had dropped everything, canceled plans, skipped meals. I had wired the money without hesitation, convincing myself it was for Eva's comfort, for my daughter's future. The memories flooded back, the nights I ate nothing but rice and beans while sending checks their way. I remembered quietly telling myself I could manage with less because I was helping them have more. It had become a rhythm, a pattern that swallowed me whole. And now, after all of it, after being told their wedding was not for me, Marcus had the audacity to ask again. No, not ask, demand, as if I were nothing more than a wallet that could speak. I let the silence stretch for a moment. My heart pounded so loudly I thought he could hear it through the line. I imagined him waiting, frowning, tapping his foot, certain I would fold, just as I always had. I pictured Eva in the background, maybe even nodding along, expecting me to obey. But something inside me had shifted. The humiliation of that wedding day had hardened into something sharper. My hands stopped trembling, my breath steadied. I lifted the phone closer and spoke slowly, clearly, in a voice that did not shake. I only help special people. The silence on his end was instant. No words, no retort, no sarcastic laugh, just nothing. For the first time, Marcus had no immediate reply. I could almost see his face twisting, caught between anger and disbelief, realizing that I wasn't playing my part anymore. I hung up before he could recover. My fingers pressed down on the button with finality, and I placed the phone back on the table. The kitchen hummed with quiet again, but it was a different quiet, not the silence of defeat, but the silence after a battle line is drawn. I leaned back in my chair, letting the words I had spoken settle into my bones. I thought about what they meant. For years, I had believed sacrifice was love, that if I gave more, Eva would feel secure, and Marcus might finally soften toward me. I had told myself it was worth every dollar, every skipped meal, every lonely night. But now, I saw the truth. They didn't see sacrifice as love. They saw it as weakness. I rose and walked to the living room. My eyes landed on the oak sofa again, its surface polished by years of use. I remembered Marcus sprawling across it, acting like a king in a palace. I remembered Eva resting her head on his shoulder, while I stood nearby, invisible in my own home. I had paid for it, but it had never been mine. I walked past the closet door, the turquoise dress still hung inside, glowing faintly under the light. It seemed to mock me less now. I touched the fabric, smooth and cool beneath my fingertips, and whispered, "Not anymore." For the first time in years, I felt a spark of control return. Not anger, not even vengeance, just a steady refusal to be used again. I had been excluded from their celebration, but I would not be their provider anymore. If my presence wasn't worthy at the table, then neither was my money. The phone buzzed again. Marcus's number flashed across the screen. I didn't answer. It rang again and again, the sound filling the house, demanding to be heard. But I stayed still, my hands folded, my resolve firm. Let it ring. Let him rage. I had nothing left to give. When the ringing finally stopped, the silence that followed felt like a victory. A small one, yes, but powerful. It was the first moment I had chosen myself over them. I stood at the window, looking out at the street, watching the world move on without knowing what had just happened inside my home. To anyone else, it was just a phone call. But to me, it was the crack of a whip cutting through years of submission. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. I whispered into the still air, "It's my turn now." That night, after refusing Marcus, I couldn't sit still. My body carried a nervous energy, my mind replaying his voice over and over. For years, I had bent to his demands, letting him dictate my spending, my choices, my very sense of worth. But not this time. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I needed to see, in black and white, just how much I had already given away. I went to the drawer in my desk and pulled out an old notebook. I found a pen that still had ink, and I spread bank statements across the kitchen table. The pile was thicker than I wanted to admit. I pressed my glasses closer to my nose and began to add everything up. The rent came first, $650 each month, every month, for 3 years, 36 months. I wrote the numbers carefully. 650, 36 equals 23,400. My hand trembled slightly as the figure formed on the page. That was nearly the cost of my husband Robert's funeral. The money he had left for me to live on, then the furniture. I remembered every item I had paid for to fill their home. The oak sofa alone was $1,400. The refrigerator had been another $1,200. The dining table, the chairs, the lamps. I wrote it all down, $4,200. Next was the used car I had bought for Eva. I had written the check for $3,000, telling myself she needed safe transportation to work. Marcus had driven it more than she did, but at the time I convinced myself it didn't matter. The bills for Marcus's medication surfaced next. I saw the receipts, the ones he handed me, insisting the pharmacy wouldn't release the pills unless I covered the gap. I had paid $1,200 over time just so he could fill his bottles. When I added it all, the total stood glaring at me from the page, $35,800. I stared at that number until my vision blurred. My hand clenched the pen so hard the ink smudged across the paper. That money had been my entire life savings. I had worked double shifts at the diner, tucked away every extra tip, gone without vacations, without new clothes, without small luxuries. I had lived frugally, telling myself it was for Eva, that she deserved a better life than I had. I had poured my years, my body, and my hope into building a foundation for her future. But what had I bought? I didn't buy love. I didn't buy respect. I had bought my way into their lives as a convenience, nothing more. I set the pen down and pressed my palms against my face. Tears slipped through my fingers. I wasn't crying for the money. I was crying because I had given all of it in the name of love, and my daughter had still looked away. I thought of Robert again. His quiet voice came back to me from the years before he passed. He had warned me not to let anyone take advantage of my kindness. He had said, "Love doesn't ask for receipts." I had nodded back then, believing I understood. Now I realized I had failed him. I wiped my eyes and looked again at the numbers. Each line told a story. The rent payments were nights I sat alone in the dark, skipping heat, so I could send the check on time. The furniture was the ache in my back from working overtime. The medication was the food I didn't buy for myself. Each dollar carried a memory of sacrifice. And yet, when their wedding came, I was not worth a seat at the table. I was not worth a mention. I leaned back in the chair, letting the quiet of the kitchen fill my ears. The refrigerator hummed softly. The clock ticked steadily. My house felt like a stranger's place, filled with things I had bought for others, but never for myself. I pushed the notebook away and stood. My legs were weak, but a new determination rose inside me. I couldn't undo the past, but I could stop the bleeding. I walked slowly upstairs. The turquoise dress caught my eye again as I passed the closet. I touched it, my fingers running along the fabric. Once it had represented hope. Now it was just a reminder of how blind I had been. I closed the closet door and whispered, "No more." Back downstairs, I folded the notebook and tucked it into my purse. The number 35,800 burned in my mind like a brand. It wasn't just money. It was proof. Proof that I had traded my dignity for their comfort. Proof that my sacrifices had been swallowed whole, leaving me empty. I sat again at the table, my hands steady this time. The tears were gone. In their place was something sharper. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about what Eva needed. I was thinking about what I needed. The weight of that realization pressed against my chest, not as pain, but as strength. I had been living for them all these years. Maybe it was time to live for myself. The next morning, I woke with a decision heavy in my chest. I could no longer sit by and let Marcus's demands control me. The numbers I had written in that notebook the night before burned in my memory, $35,800. It wasn't just a figure. It was my life, bled out little by little until nothing remained. I knew I had to cut the cord completely. I dressed carefully, pulling on a neat blouse and slacks. The sun was still low, casting a pale light through the curtains. My hands trembled slightly as I gathered the papers, the bank statements, and the notebook with my calculations. I slipped them into my purse and stepped out into the cool morning air. My breath formed small clouds as I walked to the bus stop. The bank was familiar. I had walked through those glass doors countless times, usually with Marcus or Eva trailing behind me, pretending to need my help, but really ensuring the money kept flowing. This time, I walked in alone. The polished floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the air smelled faintly of ink and disinfectant. I kept my head high as I approached the counter. When I asked to see Mr. Henderson, the teller smiled and led me back. He was an older man with kind eyes and a steady presence, someone I had known for years. He looked up from his desk, surprised to see me standing there without Marcus or Eva at my side. "Mrs. Morton," he said warmly, "what can I do for you today?" I sat down, clutching my purse in my lap. "I need to make changes," I told him, my voice firmer than I expected. He tilted his head. "What kind of changes?" I opened the notebook and slid it across his desk. He scanned the figures, his eyebrows rising as he read the totals. "This is quite a sum," he murmured. "It's everything I've given them," I said quietly. "Every rent payment, every bill, every dollar. And it ends today. I want to cancel every automatic transfer. I want all access locked down. No one touches my accounts except me." For a moment he studied me, as though weighing the years of my history against the determination in my eyes. Then he nodded slowly. "Finally, you're protecting yourself." His words felt like a small blessing. He gathered the forms, placed them neatly in front of me, and handed me a pen. My hand shook as I signed, not from fear, but from release. With each stroke of ink, I felt the chains loosen. As I pressed the last signature down, my phone began to buzz in my purse. The sound was sharp, insistent. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Eva or Marcus, probably both. The buzzing grew louder, rattling against the table. Henderson glanced at me, his brow furrowed. "Do you need to take that?" I shook my head. "No, not anymore." The buzzing stopped, only to start again seconds later. Call after call, like pounding fists against a locked door. I slid the phone deeper into my purse, refusing to let their voices invade this moment. This was mine. Henderson completed the paperwork and handed me copies. "You've taken an important step today," he said. His tone carried no judgment, only support. "Don't let them bully you into reversing it." I met his gaze and gave a small smile. "I won't." When I walked out of the bank, the air felt lighter, brighter. I stood on the sidewalk, closing my eyes for a moment as the sun warmed my face. The weight on my chest had lifted, replaced by a quiet strength. The phone buzzed again, vibrating against my side. I ignored it. Instead, I began to walk toward the bus stop, each step surer than the last. For the first time in years, I wasn't moving for them. I was moving for me. Back at home, I placed the signed forms in a drawer, safe and sealed. My phone lit up with missed calls, 10, then 15, then 20. Messages piled in, demanding explanations, dripping with outrage. I didn't read them. I set the phone face down on the table and walked away. I brewed a cup of tea and carried it to the living room. As I sat on the oak sofa, I ran my hand across the armrest again. It felt different now, not like a monument to my sacrifices, but like a reminder of what I would never do again. For the first time in a long time, I smiled. It was small, tentative, but real. The sound of my phone vibrating in the distance couldn't erase it. In fact, it only made it sweeter, because I knew those calls weren't power anymore. They were desperation, and I was finally free enough to let it ring. The days after I shut down the transfers passed in a haze of ringing phones and unanswered messages. Eva tried at first gently, then more frantic. Marcus grew harsher with every voicemail. They called me selfish, ungrateful, even paranoid. I left the phone on the counter and went about my routine. For the first time, I was not under their thumb. Yet even as I tried to hold on to that sense of freedom, a gnawing fear crept in. People like Marcus do not accept defeat quietly. One afternoon, as I returned from the grocery store, I noticed a strange car parked in front of my house. It wasn't a neighbor's. My pulse quickened. The blinds were tilted at an odd angle, as if someone inside had been careless. I gripped my keys tighter and hurried up the walkway. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and my breath caught. Eva stood in my living room, her face pale, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. Marcus lounged on the oak sofa, legs crossed like he owned the place, and beside him sat a man I didn't recognize at first. Gray suit, polished shoes, a briefcase at his side. His eyes were sharp, clinical, scanning me as if I were already a case file. Marcus rose slowly, his smile thin. "There you are. We were worried about you." His tone dripped with false concern, the same way he might address a child. Eva stepped forward. "Mom, please, sit down. We need to talk." Her voice trembled, but she didn't look me in the eye. The man in the suit introduced himself smoothly. "Dr. Rowan, attorney. We're here to ensure your well-being, Mrs. Morton." He held up a stack of papers, crisp and intimidating. "This is a power of attorney document. If you sign, it will protect you. We can manage your finances, your home, your care. It's for your safety." For a moment, the room spun. My groceries slipped from my arms, apples rolling across the floor. I had expected anger, maybe shouting. I had not expected this. An ambush dressed in legal language. Marcus gestured to the papers. "It's simple. You've been under stress. We just want to help. You don't need to worry about bills or banks anymore." His eyes glinted with triumph, daring me to resist. Eva's hands shook as she added softly, "Mom, please. You've been so tired lately. Just let us handle things." Her words cut deeper than the document in front of me. My daughter, standing on the side of the man who wanted to erase me. She had chosen him again, chosen his script over her own mother's truth. I looked at the papers, then back at Rowan. His gaze was steady, expectant, as if I were nothing more than a signature away from vanishing into silence. My chest tightened, but then something inside me steadied. I straightened my back. "No." Rowan blinked, as if he hadn't heard correctly. "Mrs. Morton, I don't think you understand." "I understand perfectly," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I thought possible. "I have never been clearer in my life." Eva's face crumpled, a flicker of shame passing through her expression. Marcus's jaw tightened, his smugness cracking for just a second. I stepped further into the room, my voice growing stronger. I know exactly what this is. You don't want to protect me. You want to control me. You've taken my money, my sacrifices, my trust, and now you want my freedom." The silence that followed was heavy. Rowan cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. "If you refuse, there could be consequences. Court proceedings, evaluations. This is an opportunity to make things easier." I lifted the grocery bag from the floor, setting it firmly on the counter. "Nothing about this is easy, but I will not sign away my life because you think I'm weak." Marcus stood, his voice rising. "You're making a mistake. Do you want to end up alone, broke, unable to care for yourself? Do you want to embarrass Eva like this?" The mention of embarrassment stung, but I refused to flinch. The only people embarrassed here should be the ones trying to steal from me under the guise of love. Eva whispered, "Mom, please." But her words were thin, fragile, almost hollow. I turned to her, finally meeting her eyes. "I raised you to be better than this." My voice cracked slightly, but I held steady. "If you choose to stand there, letting him do this, then you are not the daughter I thought I had." For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Rowan gathered his papers, sliding them back into his briefcase with a snap. "We'll take this to the next step," he said coldly. "You've left us no choice." Marcus muttered something under his breath and stormed toward the door. Eva followed, her shoulders slumped, but she didn't look back. The door slammed shut, leaving me standing in the middle of the room, groceries half spilled, my hands trembling. I bent to pick up an apple, turning it over in my palm. The skin was bruised from the fall, but still intact. I set it on the counter and let out a long breath. My heart raced, but beneath the fear was something else, resolve. They had shown their hand. They had revealed the truth of what they were willing to do. I walked to the closet, opened the door, and stared at the turquoise dress. It no longer mocked me. It stood as a witness, proof that I had believed in love, in family, in belonging, proof that I had been betrayed. I closed the door gently, whispered to myself, "I will fight." The house was quiet again, but it was no longer the silence of defeat. It was the silence before a storm I was ready to face. It didn't take long before the knock on my door came, heavy, deliberate, the kind that doesn't wait for an answer. When I opened it, a courier stood there holding a thick envelope. Court documents. My stomach dropped as I signed for them, my hand unsteady. I carried the envelope to the kitchen table and stared at it, the paper heavier than stone in my grasp. Inside, the words blurred together at first, but I forced myself to read. Marcus and Eva had filed a petition claiming I was no longer capable of handling my own affairs. Words like paranoid, mentally unstable, financially reckless jumped out at me. They had twisted every sacrifice I made into evidence against me. My chest tightened as I flipped through the pages. There were witness statements. Mr. Dalton, my neighbor across the street, had written that he often heard me shouting and that I had installed cameras because I was paranoid. He painted me as unstable, a woman losing touch with reality. I pressed the paper to the table, fighting the urge to rip it apart. Then there was a statement from Mr. Lee, the pharmacist. He had signed something saying I refused my prescribed medication. My heart sank. I had never refused anything. I realized then that Marcus must have tricked him, maybe handing him a paper under false pretenses, making him believe it was just another form. The stack also included unpaid medical bills with my name, bills I had never seen before, pages stamped in red, used as proof that I wasn't managing my responsibilities. I shook my head in disbelief. They weren't just lying. They were building a case, brick by brick, to strip me of everything. I pressed my trembling hands together and whispered, "How could they do this?" The phone rang again. This time it wasn't Marcus or Eva. It was a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. A calm, steady voice introduced herself. "Ms. Alvarez, I'm an attorney specializing in elder financial abuse. I was given your name by someone who thought you might need help." Her words hit me like a lifeline thrown into stormy water. I sat straighter. "You've seen this before?" "All too often," she said. Children, spouses, in-laws, taking advantage of trust, twisting it into control. But there are ways to fight back. You don't have to go through this alone. Tears welled in my eyes as I looked at the papers scattered across my table. The lies felt suffocating, but her voice steadied me. "Can we meet?" I asked. 2 days later, we sat together in her office. She wore a navy suit, her hair tied back neatly, her eyes sharp and kind at once. I laid the documents before her. She read them carefully, page after page, her frown deepening. "This is classic manipulation," she said firmly. "They're trying to paint you as incompetent so they can gain control of your assets. But they've made mistakes. These medical bills can be challenged. The witness statements are weak. And if Mr. Lee signed under false pretenses, we can bring him in to clarify." Her confidence gave me strength I hadn't felt in weeks. She looked me in the eye. "You've been their victim long enough. Now it's time to fight." I nodded, my throat tight. "I don't want revenge. I just want my life back." "You'll have it," she assured me. Walking out of her office that day, I felt taller. The city streets bustled around me, but I carried a sense of purpose. For so long, I had been silent, letting Marcus and Eva dictate the story. Now, with Ms. Alvarez at my side, I had a chance to tell the truth. That night, as I sat by my window, I thought about the faces of those lined up against me. Mr. Dalton, with his grudge against me for never lending him tools when he asked. Marcus, always sneering when he thought I wasn't looking. Eva, standing behind him, her silence cutting deeper than any words. And Dr. Rowan, orchestrating it all with his polished lies. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and whispered into the dark, "You underestimated me." My voice was steadier now, the fear still there but tempered by resolve. The oak sofa sat quiet in the living room, the turquoise dress still hung in the closet, and the envelope of wedding money remained unopened in the drawer. But none of these objects carried the same weight anymore. They weren't symbols of my loss. They were reminders of why I had to stand up. They wanted to take everything from me. Instead, they had given me something stronger, a reason to fight. The night after meeting with Ms. Alvarez, I couldn't shake the weight in my chest. Her confidence had lifted me for a while, but once I was home, the silence pressed harder than ever. I felt like a stranger in my own house, every corner echoing with memories of what I had given away. I needed somewhere else to breathe, somewhere I could talk without fear of being interrupted by ringing phones or knocks on the door. The next morning, I dressed in a plain coat and walked slowly toward the cemetery where Robert was buried. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of damp leaves. Gravel crunched under my shoes as I made my way down the rows of stones, each one etched with names and dates that marked the end of someone's story. My hands shook as I clutched a small bouquet of lilies, his favorite flowers, the same ones Eva had carried in her wedding bouquet. That detail had pierced me when I saw the photos online, but now I wanted to reclaim it for myself. I knelt by his grave, brushing away a thin layer of leaves that had settled on the stone. "Robert," I whispered, my voice catching in the cold air. "I've used up everything you left me, every cent. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting our daughter. But she's gone, Robert. She's chosen him." The words spilled out like water from a cracked jug. I told him everything, how I had covered their rent for 3 years, how I had bought furniture, groceries, even medication for Marcus. I told him about the wedding I was never invited to, about the power of attorney papers they tried to force into my hands. My tears fell hot on the stone as I confessed, "I don't know if I failed her or if I failed you. Maybe both." The cemetery was still, the silence broken only by the caw of a crow somewhere in the distance. I pressed my hand flat against his name, carved deep into the granite, and let myself weep. For the first time in months, I allowed the grief to consume me fully, without trying to hold it back. My shoulders shook, my chest ached, and I cried until I had no voice left. When I finally sat back, wiping my face with the sleeve of my coat, I felt emptied out, hollowed in a way I couldn't explain. I stared at the flowers, their white petals trembling in the wind, and whispered, "I'm so tired of being alone." A soft voice startled me. "You don't have to be." I turned, blinking through my tears. Nora Blake stood a few steps away, holding a small bundle of roses. Her gray hair was tucked under a scarf, her eyes warm with recognition. She lived a few houses down from me, but we had never spoken much beyond polite greetings. "I saw you here," she said gently. "I didn't want to intrude, but I know that look." She glanced down at the stone, then back at me. "I lost my daughter years ago, not to death, but to greed. She drained me dry, then cut me out of her life once I had nothing left to give. It nearly killed me." Her words hit like a mirror held up to my pain. My lips trembled. "How did you survive it?" Nora knelt beside me, setting the roses against her husband's grave. "I found people who understood. Other women like me. We kept each other afloat when our own families wouldn't." Her eyes searched mine, steady and sincere. "You don't have to go through this alone, Talia. You think you've lost everything, but what you've really lost is the illusion that they valued you. That truth hurts, but it's also what sets you free." I swallowed hard, letting her words settle. I had been drowning in the belief that my story was unique, that my humiliation was too heavy for anyone else to carry. But hearing her speak, I realized I wasn't the only one. For the first time in weeks, I felt a thread of connection instead of isolation. Nora reached out, her hand warm as it closed over mine. "Come by my house tomorrow. I'll introduce you to some friends. You'll see. You're not alone." I nodded slowly, the tears spilling again, but these were different, softer, less sharp. "Thank you," I whispered. When I finally left the cemetery, the air didn't feel quite as heavy. My grief still clung to me, but underneath it, something faint stirred, a small ember of hope, glowing against the dark. That night, as I sat by my window, the turquoise dress still hanging upstairs, I let my mind drift to what Nora had said. Other women like me, other stories of betrayal, sacrifice, and survival. The thought scared me, but it also comforted me. Maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as powerless as I thought. The next day, I walked down the quiet street toward Nora's house. My steps were slow, cautious, but there was something in my chest pushing me forward. I clutched the notebook I had filled with numbers, the evidence of every dollar I had given away. My heart pounded harder with each step. Nora welcomed me in with a warmth I hadn't felt in months. Her living room smelled faintly of cinnamon, and sunlight streamed through lace curtains. 3 other women sat around the table, their faces kind, their eyes carrying the weight of stories I could only imagine. Nora introduced them, Maria, Carmen, and Elfrida. Each of them smiled, not out of politeness, but with genuine recognition. "We've all been where you are," Maria said softly. "Different details, same wounds." I sat down, my hands tight around my notebook. At first I didn't know what to say, but then the words tumbled out. I told them about the rent, the car, the furniture, the medication, about the turquoise dress hanging upstairs, unworn, about Marcus's demand for $2,000, about the wedding I was excluded from, about the power of attorney papers shoved into my hands. They listened without interrupting, nodding slowly, their eyes steady on mine. Carmen leaned forward, her voice calm. "They call it elder financial abuse. It's a pattern. They isolate you, they guilt you, they drain you until you don't know where you end, and they begin." Hearing the words spoken aloud made my skin prickle. Elder financial abuse, a name for the storm I had been drowning in. Elfrida reached across the table and touched my hand. "But you're not too late. You've already taken the hardest step. You said no." I swallowed hard, the tears welling again. "But they're dragging me to court. They've twisted everything. They even got Mr. Lee, the pharmacist, to sign something saying I refused my medication. It isn't true." Nora's eyes sharpened. "Then we bring him in. We'll remind him what he signed and why. People like Marcus rely on intimidation, but truth has a way of surfacing." I opened my notebook, flipping it to the page with the calculations. The numbers stared back at me like scars. $35,800. That's what I've already given them. My entire life savings, and they still want more. Ms. Alvarez had joined us that afternoon, sitting quietly at first, but now she spoke. Her voice was firm, carrying the weight of experience. Those bank statements are evidence. Mr. Henderson at the bank can testify that you shut down the transfers willingly and knowingly. Mr. Lee can clarify the mistake if we get him on the stand, and these women, she gestured toward Nora and her friends, can testify to a pattern. Juries and judges need to hear voices like theirs. Maria nodded. I'll stand with you. We all will. The room felt charged with something I hadn't felt in years. Solidarity. I wasn't alone at a kitchen table covered with lies. I was surrounded by women who had lived through the same betrayal, who understood the hollow ache of being used and discarded by their own blood. Nora placed a folder on the table. Inside were affidavits, articles, and testimonies from past cases she and her friends had helped support. We call ourselves survivors, she said, not victims. We testify, we show up for each other, and we don't let them bury us in silence. I touched the papers, my hand steady now. Then, I'll be a survivor too. Later that evening, Ms. Alvarez drove me to meet Mr. Lee. He looked startled when he saw the papers I brought. His brow furrowed as he read the statement with his signature at the bottom. I didn't know this said you refused your prescription, he murmured. Marcus told me it was just to confirm you picked up the medicine. I didn't read it carefully. I felt the anger rise in me, but I kept my voice calm. They're using it against me, to prove I can't take care of myself. His face flushed with shame. That isn't true. You've always been responsible. I'll testify. I'll tell the judge exactly what happened. Ms. Alvarez nodded approvingly. That's all we need. When we left, the sky was painted with streaks of pink and orange, the sun sinking behind the trees. For the first time, I felt a flicker of something more than anger or grief. I felt momentum. Back at home, I sat by the window, looking out at the darkening street. My phone lit up again with messages, but I ignored them. I thought instead of the faces around Nora's table, the warmth of their support, the steady voice of Ms. Alvarez, and the reluctant courage of Mr. Lee. Piece by piece, I was gathering a shield. I whispered to myself, I am not alone anymore. The words felt strange at first, but then they settled in my chest like an anchor. The turquoise dress upstairs no longer felt like a mocking ghost. It was simply a dress waiting while I fought for something far more important, my dignity, my freedom, my truth. The days leading up to the hearing felt like marching toward a storm. Every morning I woke with my stomach knotted, my hands trembling as I made tea. My house no longer felt like a sanctuary. It was a waiting room, every tick of the clock bringing me closer to the moment I would stand before a judge and defend my life. Ms. Alvarez was relentless in her preparation. She visited me almost daily, spreading folders across my dining table, walking me through each page. They'll try to say you're unstable, she explained, but we'll prove you're not only capable, you're sharp. She arranged an independent evaluation with Dr. Moore, a psychologist known for his fairness. Sitting in his office, I felt my heart hammering as he asked me questions, dates, numbers, patterns. He handed me sheets of paper filled with puzzles, word games, arithmetic. My palms were damp, but I forced myself to focus. When he asked me to remember a sequence of words and repeat them later, I closed my eyes and pictured them etched in my mind. When he tested my math, I thought back to the long nights I spent balancing my checkbook to cover rent for Eva and Marcus. Numbers had always been my prison, but now they were my defense. At the end, Dr. Moore smiled faintly. You're sharper than many 20 years younger, he said. There's no sign of decline. Relief washed over me like warm light. For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly. Meanwhile, Marcus and Eva were busy spinning their story. Through whispers in the neighborhood, I learned they had hired more witnesses. Mr. Dalton was ready to repeat his lies about hearing me shout. He would insist my security cameras were evidence of paranoia. They wanted to paint me as a lonely, unstable widow who had lost her grip on reality. But Ms. Alvarez gathered my allies, Mr. Henderson was prepared to testify that I had shut down the transfers willingly and knowingly. Mr. Lee had promised to tell the truth about the paper Marcus tricked him into signing, and Nora, along with Maria, Carmen, and Alfreda, stood ready to take the stand, to say aloud what so many women endured but few spoke of. One evening, the women gathered at my home for dinner. I cooked a simple meal, stew and bread, but their presence filled the house with warmth. We laughed softly, shared stories of betrayal and resilience. It felt like a circle of strength, their voices weaving a net around me. "Don't let them scare you," Carmen said, squeezing my hand. "They feed on fear, but you've already cut their supply." Maria added, "You'll walk into that courtroom with more truth than they can ever fabricate." Their words steadied me, but the fear still lingered. At night, I paced the floor, imagining Marcus's smirk, Eva's downcast eyes, Dr. Rowan's sharp arguments. They would come armed with lies, polished to sound like truth. One afternoon, as I folded laundry, I caught sight of the turquoise dress again. I pulled it out of the closet, holding it up to the light. For a moment, I thought of throwing it away, but instead, I pressed the fabric to my chest. It wasn't a symbol of humiliation anymore. It was a reminder of what I had survived. The dress had waited in silence, just as I had. But soon, both of us would stand in the open. On the night before the hearing, I sat at my kitchen table with my notebook open. The number glared up at me, 35,800. I ran my finger over the ink, steadying my breath. That number wasn't just evidence. It was the weight of every sacrifice, every silent plea for love, every moment I had been invisible. And now it would be my voice. I prayed quietly, not for victory, but for strength. Strength to face them without trembling. Strength to speak the truth without apology. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and gray. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy dress that Robert once said made me look strong. My hands shook as I pinned a small brooch to my collar, a gift from Eva when she was still a girl. I kept it on, not as a sign of her love now, but as a memory of what once was. Ms. Alvarez met me at the courthouse steps, her presence a steady anchor. "We're ready," she said firmly. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, we're ready." As we walked into the courthouse, the weight of years pressed behind me, but with every step, I felt lighter. For the first time, I wasn't walking in to hand over money or bend under guilt. I was walking in to defend myself, to claim what had always been mine. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and paper, a mixture of history and judgment. I sat at the long table beside Ms. Alvarez, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Across the aisle, Marcus leaned back in his chair with a smug grin, Eva sitting close but looking down at her hands. Dr. Rowan shuffled his papers with confidence, glancing at me now and then like a hunter eyeing his prey. Judge Miller entered, her robe sweeping the floor, her expression stern and unreadable. The courtroom rose, then settled as she called the case. My heart pounded against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack. Dr. Rowan stood first, his voice smooth, practiced. "Your Honor, this case concerns the well-being of Mrs. Talia Morton, a 71-year-old widow whose judgment has sadly declined. We present evidence that she is paranoid, financially reckless, and unable to manage her affairs responsibly." I felt heat rise to my cheeks, but Ms. Alvarez touched my arm under the table, steadying me. Rowan gestured toward the witnesses. Mr. Dalton walked stiffly to the stand, his lips pressed in a thin line. "I've lived across from her for years," he said, his voice carrying a tone of complaint. "She yells at no one. I hear her shouting through the walls. She's installed cameras everywhere, watching people like she doesn't trust the world. It isn't normal." I wanted to shout back, to tell the court how he had begged me for money once, how I had refused, how his bitterness had curdled ever since, but I stayed silent, my nails pressing into my palm. Rowan then brought up the documents. "Here we have a statement from Mr. Lee, pharmacist, confirming she refuses prescribed medication. And here," he added, holding up a paper stamped in red, "are overdue medical bills under her name. A pattern of neglect." Marcus's smirk widened, his arm resting possessively along the back of Eva's chair. Eva dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her performance of sadness almost convincing. "She used to be my best friend," she told the court, her voice breaking. "She's like a second mom to me. But lately, she's so different. I'm scared for her." My throat tightened, but I kept my gaze on the judge. I could not break now. When Rowan finished, Ms. Alvarez rose. Her presence shifted the room instantly. Her voice was firm, deliberate, cutting through the air like steel. "Your Honor, what you've heard is not evidence of decline. It's evidence of manipulation. Elder financial abuse is a crime, and this courtroom is about to see it clearly." She called Mr. Henderson first. He testified calmly, laying out the history of my accounts. Every transaction, every transfer, was authorized knowingly by Mrs. Morton, and it was she, not her daughter or son-in-law, who came into my office to cancel those transfers. Her judgment was clear, her decision firm. She knew exactly what she was doing. Then came Mr. Lee. He looked nervous as he took the stand, but when he unfolded the statement, his face reddened. "This paper, I was misled. Marcus told me it was just to confirm she picked up her prescription. I didn't read it carefully. Mrs. Morton never refused medication. In fact, she's one of my most consistent customers. I regret signing this." A ripple went through the courtroom. Marcus shifted uneasily, his smirk faltering. Next, Ms. Alvarez presented the bank statements, the notebook, the evidence of the $35,800 I had given over the years. She laid them out piece by piece, each page a story of sacrifice turned weapon. Finally, she turned to me. "Mrs. Morton, would you like to speak?" My legs trembled as I rose, but I steadied myself on the edge of the table. I looked at the judge, then at the room filled with strangers who now knew the details of my humiliation. My voice cracked at first, but it grew stronger with every word. I gave them everything. I paid their rent, I filled their fridge, I bought their furniture, their car, even medication. I worked double shifts, lived on scraps, all so they could be comfortable. I thought I was buying love, but all I bought were transactions. And love, I said, my voice steady now, cannot be purchased. The courtroom was silent. Judge Miller's eyes softened, just slightly, as she scribbled notes. Ms. Alvarez sat down, satisfied. Across the aisle, Rowan whispered furiously to Marcus, whose smugness had drained into a tight scowl. Eva's shoulders shook as she avoided my gaze. For the first time since this battle began, I felt taller than them. My truth had been spoken, and no performance or forged paper could erase it. The judge's chambers were closed for 2 hours. I sat in the hallway with Ms. Alvarez, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles turned white. Around me, the courthouse buzzed with muted footsteps, the shuffle of papers, the occasional low murmur of voices. But in my chest, everything was loud. The thump of my heart, the echo of Eva's words on the stand, Marcus's smirk as he strutted out of the courtroom with Rowan at his side. Ms. Alvarez rested a hand gently on mine. "No matter what happens, you stood up for yourself. That matters." I nodded, though my throat was too dry to speak. I thought of Robert again, wishing he were beside me, wishing I could lean into his steady strength one last time. I closed my eyes and whispered to myself, "Please, let the truth be enough." When the bailiff finally called us back in, my knees wobbled. I rose slowly, leaning on the wooden bench for support. We filed into the courtroom, where Marcus and Eva were already seated, their lawyer whispering urgently between them. I noticed Marcus's tie was loosened, his composure cracked just slightly. Eva's mascara had smudged, leaving dark streaks under her eyes. Judge Miller entered, her robe flowing like a shadow across the bench. She adjusted her glasses, looked down at her notes, and began. "This court has considered the evidence presented," she said, her voice steady, deliberate. "On the one hand, we have allegations of paranoia, financial incompetence, and instability. On the other, We have documented proof of financial support totaling $35,800 provided by Mrs. Morton, testimony from a banker and pharmacist attesting to her sound judgment, and corroborating accounts from multiple witnesses. Her eyes lifted briefly to Marcus, then to Eva, before settling back on the file. It is the opinion of this court that the petition to declare Mrs. Morton incompetent is not only unfounded but appears to be motivated by self-interest. I drew in a sharp breath, my hand flying to my mouth. Judge Miller continued, her tone firm. Therefore, the petition is denied. All claims against Mrs. Morton are dismissed. Furthermore, the court finds troubling evidence of attempted exploitation. This matter may warrant further investigation. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. The sound rang in my ears like freedom. My knees threatened to give way, but I gripped the edge of the table and stood taller. My eyes darted to Marcus. His face had twisted into fury, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. He leaned toward me, his voice a low hiss I could still hear across the aisle. "You'll end up alone. You'll die with nothing." For the first time, I didn't flinch. I met his eyes, my voice calm, almost quiet, yet strong enough to cut through his venom. "I'm already alone, but now it's by choice." Eva covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. She couldn't meet my eyes. Her sobs weren't for me. They were for herself, for the unraveling of the story she had chosen to believe. Rowan gathered his papers briskly, refusing to look at me, his jaw set in tight frustration. Henderson, standing at the back, gave me a small, reassuring nod. Mr. Lee let out a breath like he'd been holding it the entire trial, and Nora, seated among the observers, had tears in her eyes, her lips curved in a proud smile. The bailiff called for order as Marcus stormed toward the exit, Eva trailing behind him. The slam of the courtroom doors echoed through the room, but it no longer pierced me. It sounded like release. Ms. Alvarez turned to me, her eyes gleaming. "You did it." I let out a shaky laugh, the kind that comes only when fear breaks into relief. "We did it." I walked slowly toward the exit, each step lighter than the last. The courthouse doors opened and sunlight spilled across the steps. I tilted my face upward, letting the warmth wash over me. For months I had been drowning in shadows, but now the light felt like mine again. Outside, Nora hurried to my side. She hugged me tightly, her arms firm around my shoulders. "You were magnificent," she whispered. I shook my head, tears welling. I was terrified. "And you still stood tall," she said. "That's what matters." Reporters lingered nearby, their cameras clicking, but I ignored them. I wasn't interested in becoming a spectacle. My story wasn't for headlines. It was for me, for the part of me that had been silenced, belittled, and erased. Now it was whole again. As we walked down the courthouse steps, I thought back to the turquoise dress waiting in my closet. It had been bought for a wedding I was never meant to attend. But now, I saw it differently. It was no longer a symbol of rejection. It was a reminder of how far I had come, from the woman who waited quietly to the woman who refused to sign her life away. That evening, when I returned home, I set the dress carefully on my bed. I ran my hand over the fabric, whispering, "You waited, and so did I. But waiting is over." The house was quiet, but this time the silence was sweet, not empty, not suffocating, just peace. The morning after the verdict, I woke to a house that felt different. The silence was no longer heavy or accusing. It was calm, almost welcoming. For the first time in months, I opened the curtains without hesitation. Sunlight poured across the wooden floor, warm and golden. The oak sofa caught the light, and instead of feeling like a monument to everything I had lost, it simply looked like a piece of furniture, mine, not theirs. I brewed a pot of coffee and took my mug to the porch. The street was quiet, only the sound of birds filling the air. I breathed in deeply, letting the cool air fill my lungs. The tension that had wrapped around my chest for so long began to loosen. I was free. Not just legally, but in my spirit. That afternoon, I called a locksmith. He changed every lock in the house, his tools clicking and clanking as he worked. When he handed me the new keys, I felt an odd sense of ceremony. These keys weren't just metal. They were boundaries drawn clearly at last. This house was mine again, a place where I could feel safe. I also installed new security cameras, but this time they weren't signs of paranoia as Marcus and Dalton had claimed. They were symbols of vigilance, of protecting myself without apology. When the technician left, I stood in the middle of my living room, the hum of the new system quiet but steady, and whispered to myself, "No one will corner me here again." Later that week, Nora and her friends invited me to dinner. I hesitated at first, unsure if I was ready for company, but something in me wanted to step back into life. I wore a simple blouse, brushed my hair, and walked down the street to Nora's home. Her table was set warmly, candles glowing, the smell of roasted chicken filling the air. Maria brought homemade bread, Carmen carried a bowl of fresh salad, and Alfreda arrived with a pie still warm from the oven. When I stepped through the door, they greeted me not with pity, but with open arms. We ate together, laughter weaving through the conversation. They shared stories of their own battles, courtrooms, betrayals, nights spent crying in silence. But as they spoke, they didn't sound broken. They sounded whole, survivors. At one point, Maria raised her glass. "To Talia," she said with a smile, "for proving that truth still has power." I felt my throat tighten as I lifted my glass in return. "To all of us," I whispered. The food tasted richer than anything I had eaten in months, not because of the spices, but because it was shared. Every bite felt like a reclaiming of joy. I wasn't sitting at a table where my worth was measured in dollars. I was sitting among women who understood me, who valued me without conditions. When I returned home that night, the house didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. I walked from room to room, touching the walls, the furniture, even the turquoise dress still folded on the chair. For once, I didn't see loss in these objects. I saw survival. I sat at my kitchen table, remembering Robert's voice. Years ago, he had told me, "You have to take care of yourself, Talia, even when it's hard." Back then, I thought he meant financially. Now I understood he had meant something deeper: self-respect, boundaries, the courage to say no. I poured myself another cup of coffee and looked out the window at the quiet street. The world hadn't changed, but I had, and as I sat there, the loneliness that once pressed down on me had lifted. I wasn't afraid of solitude anymore, because solitude is not the same as abandonment. Solitude can be peace. That night, I slept without waking once. No dreams of slammed doors, no visions of Marcus's sneer or Eva's downcast eyes. Just rest. When I woke the next morning, I felt lighter. My house was my home again. My life was my own. The weeks after the trial moved quietly, like a stream smoothing over rocks. For the first time in years, I wasn't checking my phone every morning for messages demanding money. The silence of my house no longer felt like a weight pressing on my chest. It was freedom. But with that freedom came a choice. What would I do with the rest of my life? One morning, I stood in the doorway of my bedroom, looking around at the things I had collected over decades. The walls seemed to whisper memories, but they no longer felt like anchors. I realized then that I didn't need the big house in the suburbs anymore. It had served its purpose, but it carried too many ghosts. Too many memories of waiting by the phone, of dinners gone cold, of sacrifices unnoticed. So I made a decision. I sold it. Packing was bittersweet. I folded clothes into boxes, stacked old dishes in crates, and carefully wrapped the turquoise dress in tissue paper. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. It wasn't a symbol of humiliation anymore. It was a reminder of the turning point in my life. The day I learned I was stronger than their cruelty. With the money from the sale, I bought a modest apartment downtown. It wasn't large, but it was bright, filled with sunlight and the hum of life outside my window. From my balcony, I could watch the city moving, a reminder that the world hadn't stopped, even when I thought my life had. Half of what I earned, I donated to a foundation that protects seniors from financial exploitation. Signing that check gave me a sense of purpose. I wanted others to know they weren't alone, that there was hope even when betrayal came from the people closest to you. For myself, I planned differently. I booked a trip to Italy, a dream I had carried quietly since my 20s. I imagined walking cobblestone streets, tasting espresso in small cafes, sketching fountains and piazzas in a notebook. I signed up for an art class too, something I had always wanted but never dared to do. For so long, my hands had written checks for others. Now they would hold brushes, pencils, colors. I also began volunteering at the community center. Twice a week, I sat with women who reminded me of myself. Tired eyes, heavy stories, but a spark still burning somewhere inside. I listened. I nodded. I shared my own story when the time was right. I saw in their faces the same disbelief I once carried, and I told them, gently but firmly, "You can take your life back." News of Eva and Marcus drifted to me occasionally. I heard they had moved into a cramped apartment, the shine of their wedding long gone. They struggled to keep up with bills, their credit cards maxed out, their plans unraveling. When I heard it, I felt no triumph, no bitterness, just relief. Their downfall wasn't my victory, my freedom was. In the evenings, I would sit by my window with a cup of tea, watching the city lights blink on one by one. I thought about the path that had led me here, the humiliation, the courtroom, the moment I stood tall and said no. I had been through fire, but I had come out with something stronger than ashes. I had come out with clarity. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living for someone else's approval. I wasn't trying to buy love or hold on to people who wanted only what I could give them. I was living for me. One Saturday morning, as I packed for my trip to Italy, I found the envelope I had once prepared for Eva's wedding. The $1,500 still sat inside, untouched, crisp bills waiting to be spent. I smiled softly and slid it into my travel wallet. It wouldn't go to her anymore. It would go to me, to gelato on a sunlit street, to a sketchbook from a small shop in Florence, to a ticket on a train bound for somewhere new. I closed the suitcase and looked around my apartment. The walls were bare now, waiting for art I would make myself. The future stretched out before me, not as a burden, but as an open road. I whispered to the quiet room, "I'm finally free." And for the first time in a very long time, I believed it. On my first night back from Italy, I sat on the balcony of my apartment, a cup of tea warming my hands. The city stretched beneath me, glittering with 1,000 lights. Somewhere below, I could hear the faint sound of laughter, the hum of cars passing, the rhythm of a world that kept moving forward. I leaned back in my chair, letting the cool evening air brush against my face, and for the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. I thought of the woman I had been only months ago, the one who waited by the phone, who counted every dollar, who clung to the hope that sacrifice could buy love. That woman lived in fear of being abandoned. She wore loneliness like a second skin. She believed her worth depended on how much she gave. And I whispered softly into the night, "That woman is gone." Now, I was someone else. Someone who had stood in a courtroom and defended her dignity. Someone who had sold her house and carved a new path. Someone who had walked the narrow streets of Rome and Florence, stood before great works of art, and sketched fountains with her own hands. Someone who could look in the mirror and see not weakness, but resilience. The stars above me glittered, sharp and steady. I let myself breathe deeply, pulling in the cool night air, and it filled me with a sense of freedom I had never known before. Alone, yes, but not lonely. Solitude was no longer punishment. It was a gift, a quiet space to hear my own thoughts, to dream without limits. I reached for my journal, the one I had bought in a little shop in Florence. Its cover was soft leather, smelling faintly of ink and dust. I opened it and began to write, the words flowing easily, as if they had been waiting all along. "True love never has a price," I wrote on the first page. My hand was steady, my letters bold. For years I had confused sacrifice with love, obligation with devotion. Now I understood that love could never be purchased or bargained for. It had to be given freely, or it wasn't love at all. I paused, letting the silence stretch, then added another line. "What would you do in my place?" I closed the journal, pressing my palm against its cover. It wasn't a question for anyone else to answer. It was a reminder to myself that my story, as painful as it had been, might one day help another woman recognize her own worth before it was too late. The turquoise dress hung in my closet still, no longer a symbol of rejection, but of transformation. I decided I would wear it soon, not to a wedding, not to prove anything to anyone, but simply for myself, to walk through the park on a sunny day and feel the fabric shimmer around me, to claim it as mine at last. The night grew deeper, the city lights softer, and I sat there a little longer, savoring the quiet. My life wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was mine again, wholly and truly mine. And that was enough. I finished my tea, closed my eyes, and let the freedom sink in, layer by layer. The woman who had once been silenced had found her voice again. The woman who had once been erased had written herself back into her own story, and this time no one could take it away.